Federal Reserve and the income tax both came into being in 1913. They did not exist before then. There was no system of central banking or reserve banking in the United States before December 28, 1913, when that statute passed. And there was no constitutional tax on incomes. There had been beforehand, but they were always destroyed by the Supreme Court. It had to go through the process of constitutional amendment that finally came in March of 1913. Can you imagine 1 year in which the two massive means of governmental intervention in the American economy are created? That's a big year. And do you also know that before 1913, there had never been a peacetime inflation in the United States? Never. The price level was always about at par. In 1912, a loaf of bread in the United States cost the same thing as it had in 1815. Can you imagine that today? What if something cost the same thing it did 100 years ago? Well, if any of you have read the opening pages of Ron Paul's book in the Fed, I mean, you know that the thing that has happened to the price level since 1913, since the Fed took over managing it, is the price level has increased 23 times. So if a loaf of bread costs, say, 10 cents in 1913, today it costs $2.30. The Federal Reserve has presided over a 23-fold increase in the price level. There had been zero increase in the price level since 1815. What happened in the 19th century when the price level was stable? It went up during the Civil War because the Union government went off the gold standard and overprinted because everything was extra legal in the Civil War. There was kind of an approximation of the Federal Reserve. As soon as the war ended, the Union government had okay, and they just restored the price level. In that era of stable prices, the growth rate of the American economy was 67% higher than it would be after the Federal Reserve was created. If we had maintained the rate of economic growth that the nation had achieved in the century before 1913, today we would be 5 times richer. 5 times. That actually is the bottom line cost of having the institutions of 1913. We can actually put a value on it. We can see what the trend of economic growth was before the creation of the Fed and the income tax, but 4.7% per year. Since then, the best long-term trend we've had is 3.3%. If you extrapolate it out, the statistics, over 100 years, we'd be 5 times richer today. So that's just the bottom line cost. And any growth that we've had since then has occurred for one reason, because we restricted those two institutions, specifically the income tax, but also the Federal Reserve. A word about the income tax on its founding. Some of you may know this, it's in some of the Tea Party literature, as it should be. It's in Ron Paul's book, too, and some of his work. The first top rate of the income tax, of course, is now 35%. Actually, if you throw in the Medicare stuff, it's a little higher than that. The top rate of the income tax on the founding of the income tax in 1913 was 7%, 1/5 of the top rate of the income tax today. In 4 years, it was 77%. The income tax increased 11-fold in 4 years after 1913. There had been no income tax in the United States before 1913. In 1917, the income tax is 77%. Moreover, the Federal Reserve, on its creation, immediately caused a 100% inflation in the United States. Prices increased 100% in the 4 years after 1913. There had never been a peacetime inflation in the United States ever. And this is when the United States was neutral in World War I. Well, the income tax coupled with this huge inflation just killed people. Right? Let's say you double your salary. You better double your salary if prices have doubled. Oh yeah, that's going to throw you into a higher tax bracket all the way up to 77%.
Wow.
We came to call this stagflation. That would be a new word that was invented not in the 1970s, but exactly this happened in the 19-teens. The Federal Reserve plus the income tax managed to do the following. Whatever the private sector is doing, transform it into government revenue. Because if the price level increases, that means people have to get higher wages. Higher wages get thrown into higher and higher tax brackets all the way up to 77%. So if the private sector gets going, the federal government will just take more and more of it through revenue. The economic crisis of 1919 to 1921 was actually the worst the nation had ever seen. And it's funny, we never hear about it. Who has ever heard about the economic crisis of 1919 to 1921? There's only one reason we haven't heard about it. because the Fed and the income tax conspired to cause the Great Depression a dozen years later. That's the only reason we have that this thing is in the shadows. Because if there hadn't been a Great Depression in the 1930s, we'd hear a lot about the Great Depression of 1919 to 1921. Before the Federal Reserve and the income tax, unemployment had never been in the double digits. In fact, unemployment wasn't even a word until 1896. It didn't even exist in the vocabulary, in the dictionary, because you don't describe things that don't exist. The United States was pulling in 10 million workers a decade. Jobs, jobs, jobs. Anytime a factory threw people out of work, it was a short-term situation. People found work in a matter of weeks. There was no such thing as chronic unemployment. The word did not need to exist. Unemployment at 18% in 1919. Easily 50, 60, 100%, 200% more than it had ever been in American history. Of course it hit 18%. I mean, if an entrepreneur wants to hire workers and starts getting more revenue, that entrepreneur will find more and more of his income being siphoned off by the 77% marginal rate of the income tax. So I just said this terrible situation in which prices are up 100%, nobody has a job, there are strikes all over the land, a Boston police force, a nationwide steel strike. Aren't really any unions in the country, it's a nationwide steel strike. Yeah, this is crazy. And you know what? It ended. The Roaring '20s ensued. And there's a little transition, not so little, that happens in 1921 when Warren Harding comes into office. Warren Harding, the Republican, defeats Cox. There's a Professor Cox back there. It's no relation. Warren Harding delegated his Secretary of the Treasury, Andrew Mellon, to solve the problem. And Andrew Mellon had had a lot of experience in finance and business. Of course, started Gulf Oil, Spindletop in 1901. Before 1913, before the Federal Reserve and the income tax. And he realized that the root of all the problems were these new institutions of 1913. And he said, what we got to do is we got to restrain these two things. The Federal Reserve is going to do one thing and one thing only, preserve the value of the dollar. The value of the dollar does not go down, does not go up. It stays the same forever. That's what it did in the 19th century when we grew at 5.5% per year for a century. Federal Reserve, target the price of gold. Price of gold goes up, restrict money, price of gold goes down, print money. Got that? Okay. Income tax, you're going to be reduced by 2/3. Marginal rate of the income tax is 77, we're going to cut that down to 25. Arranges for both of these things in 1921. The most famous decade of American prosperity ensues, the Roaring '20s, in which you have an exact repeat of the 19th century. Growth near 5% per year, lasts for 7 years. No problem. Now, I've heard so many times, I've heard it from the current President of the United States, we know what caused the Great Depression. The Great Depression was caused by Wall Street, by business, by capitalism. It was a crisis of capitalism. We've heard that ad nauseum. That's completely false. The Great Depression was caused by the Federal Reserve and the income tax. The Federal Reserve in 1929, following 7 heady years of prosperity in which the entire 1919-1921 debacle was ended. The price level stayed flat in the 1920s. Taxes were hacked down. The economy took off. In 1929, the Federal Reserve decided that it wanted to fool with the price level. It wanted prices to go down by 50%. Went up by 100%, now we want them to go down by 50%. Remember what things cost in 1913, and then those prices doubled? We want to take them back down to what they cost in 1913. They wanted to cause a deflation. They got this done, by the way. Prices got down to the 1913 level by 1933. And people like, the old hands, Benjamin Strong, who's one of Mellon's associates, he had died a few years before, he would have wondered, what are you doing? Just stable prices. I mean, if prices go down constantly, the Federal Reserve says, we're going to starve the money and the economy of money because we want prices to go down. Well, let me tell you, I mean, if you know things are going to be cheaper next week than they are now, next year than they are now, you're not going to buy anything. If you know you're going to get less money in the future if you're a business, if you make an investment, you're not going to make any money, but if you hold your money, it gets more and more valuable. You're not going to act. The Federal Reserve decided it wanted to reclaim the 1913 price level instead of holding prices stable. That caused a deflation for 4 years, which is at the root of the Depression.